Good morning. Good morning. It's good to see everyone here today. So, in recent weeks, we've been discussing the Diamond Sutra, and I may take a little detour today. A little detour prompted by this last passage that we studied. The passage was relatively short. Subhuti, what do you think? Has the Tathagata attained the supreme awakening? Has he something he can preach? Subhuti said, World honored one, as I understand the teaching of the Buddha has no doctrine to convey. The truth is ungraspable, inexpressible. It neither is nor is not. How is it so? Because all noble teachers are exalted by the unconditioned. So, this notion that the Buddha has nothing to preach, there's no doctrine, would seem to fly in the face of the volumes of recorded teachings that he generated over the course of 45 years of teaching. So how do we put all this together? What are these teachings? Well, Mu Song and other commentaries have suggested, reasonably, that the way to square this circle is to consider the teachings skillful means, that they are not the end in themselves, that they are the means to an end, which is a way of perceiving the world that is inexpressible, ungraspable, so that they are signposts in a way, which is not to say that they can be ignored or dispensed with. They have value, but they are not the thing in itself. The Mahayana movement, later Buddhism, may have been motivated in part as a reaction to what was perceived as excessive scholasticism, where monks, in studying the Buddha's teachings, started elaborating more and more, creating lists within lists, having concepts about concepts, having categories within categories within categories, generating further volumes, trying to explain with words what the Buddha was trying to convey. So the Mahayana movement, in some ways, is a movement of simplification, a movement of application, applying the teachings with the notion that the teachings really have no value unless they are expressed in our lives, unless they are applied. So I thought, at least for me, a useful detour at this point would be to go back to some of these teachings of the Buddha that are recorded. And a logical place to start would be the very first teaching of the Buddha after his enlightenment, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, turning of the wheel sutta. in which the Buddha talks about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. We've discussed these in the past, but it's been a while. It's been quite a while, I think, since we sort of went through these. And we'll go through them somewhat briefly, but just to revisit, in the context of the Diamond Sutra, what are we to make of these teachings? How are we to use them? How are we to apply them? And where are they leading us? So the background for the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta is that the Buddha, after, well, he basically, the Buddha hit bottom with asceticism, was starving by the roadside near death, as the story goes. And Sujata, a young peasant woman, noticed him there and brought him milk and rice. And with that nourishment, he started to recover. And he concluded at that point, having hit bottom with asceticism, that asceticism was not the way, that mortification of the flesh just led to mortification of the flesh, but not to any kind of wisdom or spiritual advancement. And of course, he already knew from his former life that indulging in sensual pleasures had its limits as well, that also did not lead to spiritual advancement. So he adopted what he called the middle path, which was a notion that he applied in various ways throughout his teachings. The middle path between asceticism, just mortification of the flesh, and indulging in the flesh. So at first he was uncertain as to whether to, try to express his understanding after awakening, but he decided to do so, and he encountered the 5 companions who had been with him on this quest of asceticism. And he initially they were kind of upset with him for, sort of falling away, for sort of selling out to milk and rice. But they did listen to him, and he gave this little talk in which he expressed the Four Noble Truths. We're going to kind of focus on the Eightfold Path, but the Four Noble Truths, as you probably know, are the truth of, or the truth or the teaching of, whether you call it a truth or a teaching, I don't know, the observation that life is difficult, dukkha, difficulty, stress, that birth is difficult, stressful, that sickness is stressful, old age is stressful, death is stressful, sorrow, lamentation, grief, and despair are stressful. Association with the unbeloved is stressful, as well as separation from the beloved is stressful. Not getting what you want is stressful. And he said, in short, the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful. Basically, the notion, 5 clinging aggregates, having contact with what's around us and wanting things to be just so, which is never the way they are, never the way they quite are, so that we're always unsatisfied. So that is the first observation. The second is that the stress, the difficulty, the suffering has a cause, which is usually translated as craving, more literally thirst, tanha, thirst, just a desperate desire for things to be other than the way they are, a desire for the pleasant things to stay the way they are and for the unpleasant things to go away. And then the third observation was that there's a way out, that one doesn't have to be drowning in sorrow and suffering, distress, that there is a way out. And the fourth observation is the Eightfold Path, which is the best the Buddha could do in describing how to escape this constant anxiety, distress, suffering that characterized much of human existence. So the Eightfold Path. And it's called a path, although the 8 elements are, as virtually all commentators will note, not sequential. Like you don't go grade 1 through grade 8 and then you graduate. But they all support one another, all of the eightfold elements. And the one way of illustrating that is to have a mental image of a wheel, which is a image that appears frequently in Buddhist architecture and art, an 8-spoked wheel. And in order for the wheel to operate smoothly, really all spokes have to be intact, have to be developed, have to be maintained. And if you just work on one and not the others, the wheel cannot be supported and does not function as a wheel. So they all support one another, they're all important, and they all are cultivated concurrently. So there's 3 main categories of these elements of the Eightfold Path. The first being the wisdom category, so-called wisdom category, right view, right intention or aspiration. And then the morality, sometimes called the morality category, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and the meditation category at the end, which is right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Some people are put off by the word right, and rightly so. It sounds like we're setting up something in contrast to wrong. And these, whenever you have a dichotomy of right and wrong, you get into all kinds of judgments. And the Pali word for that's translated as right is sama, and sama can be translated as appropriate. It actually is thought to come from an earlier Vedic word, samyak, which which means together or connected. You could extend that to think of harmonious view, harmonious intention. So if the word right bothers you, you can translate it some other way. I thought we'd talk just a little bit about right view, the first on the list. Um, Samadhi. Sometimes it's described as seeing things the way they are. Um, I have a little problem with that, in that I'm not sure us humans ever see things fully the way they are, but we do have different perspectives. And I prefer to think about right view, if we're going to use that phrase, as having a perspective that is most harmonious. Right view. The Buddha was asked about at one point, in one of the suttas describes his monks asking him, well, what is right view? And he gave, just various um, definitions of right view. One of them was right view is understanding the Four Noble Truths, which seems a little recursive, but um, that would be one way of looking at it. And another is right view is proper discernment of what is wholesome versus what is not wholesome. What leads to long-term benefit for oneself and others versus what leads to long-term harm for self and others. Being able to discern those things, having the skill to do that, the wisdom to do that. I had a couple experiences yesterday, thinking about right view. Um, One is that one of the people who um, goes with me on the truck for the food pantry, Ron, he is sort of a full-time volunteer person. He volunteers at the food pantry all the time, and he volunteers for his church. When they have their festivals, he volunteers with the Knights of Columbus when they have their barbecues and when they have their fundraisers and so he's just sort of a full-time volunteer, overtime volunteer. So he's volunteering for things. He volunteers for the community at the community park when they have their events, all this kind of thing. So anyway, he was telling me about his weekend, and he had they'd celebrated the Mother's Day by taking his wife's mother, who is still living, to church, and then he and his wife in the afternoon went out to a winery out near Augusta, and he happens to know he's lived in the area all his life. He happens to know the owner of the winery, and he arrived at the winery, and it was very crowded. Nice day, good music, a lot of people there, parking lot almost full. And he happened to run into the owner who was out actually working the crowd. And he said, "Well, are there any tables available?" And the owner said, "Oh yeah, Ron, yeah, I'm glad to see you, etc." And then he takes Ron and his wife to a table right up front on the patio, just a perfect spot. And Ron told me, he said, well, "Wait a minute, I don't want to be taking somebody else's table, In other words, don't be doing me special favors." Um, and the owner said, "No, these people just left. They didn't stay as long as they intended, and the table's open. Why don't you sit here?" And so they did, and they enjoyed the afternoon. But that transition, I think, that must have taken place from, I mean, it seems like kind of an ordinary thing, a mundane thing, but that transition that must have taken place between, "Oh, we get this wonderful table, how nice," to, "Oh, wait a minute, this we aren't getting, we aren't jumping the line, are we? We aren't taking somebody else's table. We aren't, in a sense, cheating here just because I happen to know the owner." That transition from just delight at essentially sensual pleasure to a perspective of, "Well, wait a minute, there are other people. I don't want to be hurting someone else. I don't want to be interfering with someone else's pleasure." Maybe I'm overinterpreting here, but that's the way it occurred to me that his mind might have run automatically. That perspective of what's wholesome and what's not wholesome. Another thing that happened yesterday was in the parking lot. We got back. There was a beat up pickup truck with a crudely painted phrase on the side. It said, "God is coming." And I thought about what what must it be like to have that perspective, to have the worldview that God is coming, to have that kind of God as part of one's perspective, and to think that he is coming. You can't help but add, "and boy, is he pissed." So the kind of perspective that we have makes so much difference. And the Buddha, in the first element of the Eightfold Path, is encouraging us to pay attention. What kind of perspective do we have? The very first verse in the Dhammapada really kind of addresses this. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows, as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows, like a never departing shadow. So this part of the Eightfold Path invites us to really pay attention to how we view things. Samadite, right view. So I think I'll stop there with with the questions of um, how do we apply these teachings, which I think the Diamond Sutra is really inviting us to do, is to bring them into our lives and not just read about them or think about them or elaborate about them with words, but how do we bring life to them? And also, to what extent do we have choice about our perspectives? Do you ever notice a change in perspective that changes everything? So thank you for listening. And we'll then go into breakout rooms, and I'll see you back in a few moments.